purpose of this video is to focus on the beginnings of our look at like civil rights and specifically focusing on protections against racial discrimination. So there are a handful of amendments that deal with racial discrimination. The Civil War amendments that are passed in the aftermath of the Civil War in the mid 1860s are classic examples. 13th Amendment officially abolishes slavery, so it outlaws slavery. The 14th Amendment basically classifies former slaves as citizens. The other sort of significant thing that this does is that it, at the end, acknowledges the fact that like every person should be guaranteed equal protection of the laws. So this is super significant. It's referred to as the Equal Protection Clause that you can find within the 14th Amendment because of the fact that it is the basis for every discrimination lawsuit in this country. If you feel like you're being racially discriminated against, or because of your gender, or your sexual orientation, or your age, or your disabilities, you file it under the fact that your 14th Amendment equal protection sort of rights are being violated. You're not being like treated equally under the eyes of the law. So it's an immensely important amendment dealing with all types of discrimination. We also talked about the fact the 14th Amendment includes the Due Process Clause, which forces the states to follow all of the Bill of Rights amendments as well. So the 14th Amendment is a super significant amendment. And then the 15th Amendment basically provides voting rights for African American males. It's important to note that this did not apply to African American females. No females, any race, were voting in the 1860s, and that wouldn't be something until the 19th Amendment is passed, unfortunately, all the way until 1920. So 13, 14, and 15 are super significant racially discrimination-oriented amendments. Changes were slow to come. It wasn't like a magic wand was waved after the passing of these three amendments. Jim Crow laws were established across the South in the wake of the Civil War. These essentially established legalized segregation. Poll taxes were implemented, essentially charging individuals to vote, disqualifying large numbers of former slaves that were impoverished after the Civil War, and preventing African Americans from voting in large numbers. The implementation of the grandfather clause in some states, which required individuals to only be able to vote if you could demonstrate that your grandfather had voted. Again, disqualifying large numbers of former slaves and large numbers of African Americans. So again, changes were very slow to come. And literacy tests too. The idea of you being demonstrated to being forced to demonstrate your ability to read or to pass like a basic like civics test before being able to vote. And again, largely these were targeted disqualifying, disenfranchising, preventing large numbers of African Americans from being able to vote. So despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, changes were very slow to come to promote equality for African Americans. There also are other pieces of sort of like laws and additional amendments that sort of deal with racial discrimination. So, for example, the 24th Amendment in 1964 specifically addressed the idea of poll taxes and eliminated the qualification of like pay money in order to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which eliminated all other areas of sort of like segregation throughout the United States. The Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Ford only eliminated segregation in areas of like public education. It didn't apply to any of the other areas of society that were still segregated. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 officially ends segregation in all like forms. It's also important that you know the difference between de jure segregation and de facto segregation. De jure segregation is like legally enforceable segregation that ended with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's important to note that there are types of segregation that you sort of like can't legislate, right? It's like sort of like informal pressures or things that can't like be legally enforced. And you make someone feel like uncomfortable when they want to move into your neighborhood or something like that. It's not illegal. It's probably very much undesirable. But it's sort of like the segregation that exists in other elements, but they're not legally enforceable. Um, and then the 64 Civil Rights Act is also significant because it ended race as being a sort of employment factor. It's obviously a violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act if you choose not to hire somebody solely because of their race. And then, like, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is significant because it tried to sort of keep an eye on southern states that were like sort of still trying to prevent African Americans from voting almost 100 years after they won that right from the 15th Amendment. This specifically required preclearance, which is any Southern county that had a history of discriminating against African American voters. Essentially, anytime it wanted to make a change to its voting sort of procedures, would have to get clearance from the Justice Department before the changes were implemented to ensure that they were being done for legitimate reasons and not another attempt to try and disenfranchise or prevent African Americans from voting. And if you look, like, these are all of the areas in the red, essentially, that were covered under this act and well into the 2000s.